everyone for being here. This is an amazing turnout, so thank you so much. I am Jennifer Borland, and I'm the director of the OSU Center for the Humanities. The OSU Center for the Humanities is dedicated to increasing the visibility of the humanities, fostering new research, and demonstrating the important contributions that the humanities make to culture and society. Our work often involves events like today's lecture, and we also have a Humanities Research Group Fellowship Program, now in its third year, which fosters the development of new transdisciplinary research projects grounded in the humanities. You can always find information on our website and on social media, or visit us at our office in Life Sciences East. And if you aren't already on our email list, please contact us at humanities at okstate.edu to be added to it, or you can sign up at the back of the room. We've got a bunch of swag that you can take away and other information about upcoming events. We have organized today's event with many collaborators, including the OSU Library, Gender, Women's, and Sexuality Studies, and American Studies. And the number of co-sponsors, I think, reflects nicely the expansiveness and broad scope of Dr. Siddon's work. Before I introduce Dr. Siddons, I would like to state that we acknowledge that the land granted to Oklahoma State University was originally inhabited and cared for by First Americans. We also recognize and acknowledge that OSU resides and operates upon the territorial lands currently inhabited and preserved by citizens of 39 sovereign tribal governments within Oklahoma. As a land grant institution, OSU is committed to engaging in university and community efforts to represent and honor the proud cultural heritage and history of Native citizens throughout the state and nation, including our students, faculty, staff, and alumni. OSU continues to respect and serve the sovereignty of the original indigenous peoples, owners and protectors of these lands by cultivating and strengthening our institutional collaborations with sovereign tribal nations and their citizens. And with that, Dr. Louise Siddons is Professor of Visual Politics, Head of the Department of Art and Media Technology, and Director of the Winchester Gallery at the Winchester School of Art at the University of Southampton in the UK. Her publications include Good Pictures Are a Strong Weapon, coming out in 2024, but physically not quite, so very soon. As well as, and that is coming out with University of Minnesota Press, and Centering Modernism, published in 2018 by the University of Oklahoma Press, as well as Contributions to Art and Activism in the 21st Century, Rethinking Regionalism, and Authenticity in North America. Her essays have been published in American Art, Frontiers, a Journal of Women's Studies, Panorama, the British Art Journal, and African American Review. It is a special treat for us to host Louise because she worked at OSU for many years. It is a delight to welcome back a colleague who we have missed having on our campus. Today's talk is based on her new book, Good Pictures Are a Strong Weapon, Laura Gilpin, Queerness and Navajo Sovereignty. I also want to mention that the talk will wrap up about 5, and then we have time for proper reception. So I hope that you'll hang out for a little while after the talk, have a conversation about what we've heard, and enjoy some refreshments. And with that, I would like to ask you to please join me in welcoming Dr. Louise Siddons.
Thank you, Jen, for that generous introduction. I have multiple microphones because it's being recorded, so I'll try to pay attention to this one as well. Thank you, everyone, for being here this afternoon. It's a real pleasure and privilege to be back at Oklahoma State, where many of you nurtured this project in its early stages. In addition to the land acknowledgement, I like to point to concrete ways in which we can support Indigenous people in the present. Within Native communities, 2S LGBTQ people are additionally marginalized. This year, for the first time, the International Two-Spirit Gathering is being held in Oklahoma, co-sponsored by the All Nations Two-Spirit Society and the Indigenous Arts Alliance. You can support the gathering and those who attend it by donating via the link on the screen. And thank you if you choose to do so. The slides for this talk, I'm gonna do a kind of content preview. The slides for this talk include a photograph of part of a Navajo sand painting created during a healing ceremony. It was taken by Laura Gilpin in 1951. She intentionally photographed only a fragment, and she had the permission of the singer and the patient to create the image and include it in her book, thereby entering it into the public record. But it is considered inappropriate by some Diné today to share images of ceremony, so I wanted to make sure that all of you knew that it was going to happen, and you can make the choice about whether to stay here. My talk addresses some of the open questions that concern historic consent and cultural sovereignty, and I share Gilpin's image in that context and for that reason. I've given my talk today the same title as my book, Good Pictures Are a Strong Weapon. It's a quote from Laura Gilpin herself, who was writing to Sam Akia, then chairman of the Navajo Nation, about the photographs that she had taken for him in support of Navajo land claims. I believe what she said. By creating a visual archive that supported the other data being collected by the Land Claims Commission in the 1950s, Gilpin was helping to arm Diné leadership in their fight for sovereignty. But archives have limits, and I intend my subtitle, Creating History at the Limits of the Archive, to prompt us all to ask how we as scholars contend with those limits. So I'll begin at the beginning. What do I mean by archive, and where, according to me, are its limits? By the archive, I mean specific archives, which Stuart Hall memorably described as representing the end of a certain kind of creative innocence and the beginning of a new stage of self-consciousness, of self-reflexivity. Such archives are created or assembled with intent and seek to document specific histories. In the case of the Land Claims Commission, the history of US government land theft from Native nations. By archives, I also mean the collective presence anywhere in the public world of objects, documents, recordings, and other things that relate to the past, particularly when they're conceived of in relation to a specific subset of historical experience or knowledge. For instance, the Laura Gilpin papers at the Amon Carter Museum of American Art in Fort Worth, and we're looking at a photograph of the website. With that archive, you can actually go and search most weird first page chunks of the archive online and then go and see it in person at the museum as well. Turning again to Hall, we can understand the instantiation of even such a conceptual archive as the moment at which the whole apparatus of a history slips silently into place. In the archive, individual manuscripts, artworks, books, and ephemera are given meaning through aggregation and association that they do not have alone. Indeed, this archival logic is so familiar it hardly seems worth mentioning. Likewise, the limits of an archive seem straightforwardly identifiable. Either we have certain information in there or we don't. For many years, feminist and lesbian historians, among others, have called our attention to the connection between archival absences and distorted histories, and have sought to fill those gaps, seeking out and aggregating new archives and applying new methods of inquiry to old ones. Such analyses make it clear that, like any text, an archive is a collective rather than individual self-consciousness, generated by public consensus about its limits, its boundaries. What belongs in the archive and what is beyond its scope is determined by users who generate out of the archive canons of cultural histories. For scholars of queer history, these archivally driven canons present their own limits, even as the archive itself seems endlessly generative. Literary scholar Heather K. Love suggested in 2007 that the longing for community across time is a crucial feature of queer historical experience, produced by the historical isolation of individual queers, as well as by the damaged quality of the historical archive. This longing makes us love finding ourselves in an archive. If we can't afford to be seen in the present, she suggests, we celebrate ourselves in the past. But what can we expect to find if, as she asserts, the archive itself is already damaged by the homophobia of its creators and contributors? This paradoxical quest in which we seek ourselves in precisely the places responsible for erasing us leads directly to Love's skepticism about both the existence and the validity of trans historical queer community. But this hasn't stopped queer studies from pursuing it. In fact, we've extended this project of salvage well beyond the obvious archives to encompass a theoretical stance in which queerness sometimes seems ubiquitous, and community is everywhere and everywhen, as long as you know how to see it. Extraordinarily, given this expansive disciplinary attitude, the apparent archive of, for example, lesbians in the United States remains vanishingly small, seemingly limited to a literary and artistic canon that is urban, wealthy, and overwhelmingly white. Cheryl Dunye's 1996 film, Watermelon Woman, speaks directly to this particular archival limit. Dunye collaborated with artist Zoe Leonard, who invented a comprehensive photographic archive for the Black lesbian actress Faye Richards to be used in Dunye's film. Although Richards was inspired by real actors who were uncredited in early 20th century films, she was a fictional character. Responding to the filmmaker's desire to create a Dunyementary, a documentary film that augmented the archival record in order to present a more accurate historical story, Leonard built up a body of images that ranged from promotional headshots to family snapshots. She borrowed from Dunye's family photos, but also tapped into a moment of unprecedented, albeit overwhelmingly white, visual richness in lesbian history. Romaine Brooks, Claude Cahun, Lottie Lazarstein, and others created iconic representations of Havelock Ellis's invert, the masculine woman whose literary icon was Stephen Gordon. Dunye and Leonard emphasized the importance of invented and imagined archives as a corrective to truth, inverting a standard academic trope in which the historian goes to the archive to uncover truth. Dunye suggests instead that the historian's task is to insert truth into the archive in order to correct its oversights. As critic Kristen Lubin wrote in Aperture, "Who cares if it's technically fictional? It retroactively materializes a history and a lineage for us that we want and need." In some sense, both Dunye and Love have me pegged. My book, Good Pictures Are a Strong Weapon, is a celebration, albeit a cautious one, of intersectional queer community across time, and it is rooted in two archives, Gilpin's existing one held at the Amon Carter Museum of American Art, and an archive in progress being created by the Diné photographer Bean Yazzie. Those of us who work with Indigenous archives have to contend not only with the archive's certain absences, but also the fact that an object or piece of information's presence in the archive is inappropriate. As the scholar Shay Welch put it in 2019, some things are not meant to be known, regardless of whether or not we can ask questions about it or if we could imagine some such possibility. How do communities come to consensus about what is meant to be known? And what do we do as historians, artists, and community members when disagreement arises, either in a single moment or over time? Laura Gilpin was a white lesbian photographer who spent 35 years collaborating with her partner Betsy Foster and a variety of Navajo friends and consultants to create her 1968 photo book, The Enduring Navajo. My own book explores the possibilities and limits of her advocacy for Navajo self-determination and sovereignty in the context of her life as a lesbian, an identity that has largely been erased by historians, with the result that the political context of queer liberation throughout the 20th century has never informed readings of her allyship with Navajo people. My project began to take shape during a month-long residency at the Amon Carter. As I looked at thousands of photographs and read hundreds of letters, I realized that what I was seeing didn't match what I'd been reading in the extant scholarship on Gilpin, what, in effect, I had been primed to look for. Some of the most prominent academic voices describe her work as romanticizing, primitivizing, and solipsistic, whereas what I saw in her personal archive was a politically engaged, collaborative activist for Navajo cultural and political sovereignty throughout the 1950s and 60s. I also saw her love letters to and from Betsy. I don't know if you can read these, so I'm just going to read them to you. The top one is from Laura to Betsy, and she ends her letter saying, "And remember how I love you, love you, love you." This is the bit where I get emotional. Every time I talk about this, I'm like, oh my God, they were so cute. So then Gilpin, Foster writes back to Gilpin, this is years later, the first one's from 1918, and this is a letter from 1921, but she says, "I've broken my fountain pen and am bereft. If you cannot read this, it will at least serve to remind you that I am thinking of you and loving you and looking for a letter as usual, and how. Oh, and soon, sorry. Hope the muffins came out all right." I love the domesticity of the muffins. Anyway, after Gilpin's papers arrived with no restrictions at the Amon Carter in 1979, she bequeathed them to the museum. It became increasingly egregious for historians to continue to refer to Foster as Gilpin's friend or companion, without acknowledging the social forces that led Gilpin to use that word herself, and without acknowledging the many other more intimate and more explicit words that Gilpin also used for her partner of half a century. And yet, most notably in the case of the authoritative 1986 biography of Gilpin produced by Martha Sandweiss for the Amon Carter, Scholars have repeatedly ignored this aspect of Gilpin's life. I've heard a variety of explanations for this, that the 1980s were a different time, for example, as though that excuses falsifying the historical record, and that Gilpin's sexuality was a personal concern that had no public significance. After all, where are the lesbian themes in her photographs? Excuse me. Such objections echo the assumption made by Love that the primary motivation for engaging with archives in queer studies is a search for identification, for a queer community across history. But directly and otherwise, Gilpin's lesbianness put her at the center of distinct networks that were actively shaping museology, anthropology, and even the history of photography. In other words, her career has historical significance in large part because of her lesbianism. It, and indeed the broader modernist history of the American Southwest, can only be seen accurately if we look at it through this lens. In Gilpin's work with Navajo people and landscapes, she extends the queer politics of visibility so that the apparitional lesbian joins forces with the vanishing Indian, and they work together to reassert themselves as substantial and present in the political visual field of 20th century American culture. Thanks in part to her experiences as a lesbian, Gilpin's work queers the archive, not simply adding lesbian or Navajo data points to existing histories, but radically reinterpreting the archives from which that history has been written from lesbian and Diné perspectives. And she asks us to do the same with her own archive. Historians who refuse to acknowledge Gilpin's sexuality can hardly be expected to trace her lesbian network. But it is also true that absent any awareness of their sexuality, there are no obvious connections between the women with whom she corresponded, visited, and collaborated. Relatively few of them lived in close proximity to one another, and Gilpin never overtly cited their sexuality as a reason for their social ties. Instead, they encountered one another as colleagues or friends of friends in need of Gilpin's photographic services or products. By the 1950s, organizations like the Daughters of Bilitis were bringing lesbian women together purely on the basis of their shared sexuality. But Gilpin's social and professional circles had begun forming decades earlier, and in a necessarily more ad hoc manner. Despite this, Gilpin maintained her connections with queer women more assiduously than their purely professional connections would otherwise justify. As a result, her lesbian network had a profound impact on her career and personal life. Gilpin discovered the power of such networks early on through her friendship with sculptor Brenda Putnam and other women in New York, London, and Paris. The photographer made her living doing commercial work ranging from studio portraiture to architectural and archaeological documentation, and many of her sales and commissions came through these connections. So how and how intentionally did Gilpin's lesbian network grow? There is little evidence that the photographer specifically sought out queer women. For instance, Gilpin received a commission to create an advertising brochure for the Sandia School for Girls, a residential school in Albuquerque, New Mexico, through its architect, John Gaw Meem, who was a longtime family friend and client. Presumably unbeknownst to Gilpin, Helen Seth Smith and Carol Preston were on the school's staff. And although they left the Southwest just a year later, they stayed in close touch with Gilpin and Foster for the rest of their lives. So we're looking at a staff photo here, and my standard joke when I show this photo is it's spot the lesbian. And it is a joke because you can see Helen Seth Smith is dressed for her job, which was PE teacher and sometimes archaeologist, an archaeology teacher. So she's the only one in pants there. But Carol, her partner, is also in the photo, and I defy you to decide which one Carol is. So there you go. You can ask me afterwards. Preston repeatedly invited Gilpin to share her work with her students and other regional audiences, widening Gilpin's reach for her Navajo project and materially supporting Gilpin and Foster in the process. When Foster died in 1972, Seth Smith wrote to Gilpin expressing deep empathy with the experience of caring for a profoundly ailing partner. "I suffered with you during my visit with you last fall," she wrote, "for my own situation was somewhat similar." Foster's death prompted dozens of Gilpin's friends, acquaintances, and colleagues to send letters of condolence. Many are signed by single women, just as many are signed by couples, both lesbian and otherwise. At Sandia, Seth Smith and Preston had worked with another couple, Jean Moore and Gretchen Schickel, who ran the Forest Park Resort nearby and the riding school adjacent to the Sandia School, and also taught the Sandia students riding. They're mentioned in a condolence letter to Gilpin from Bertha Bourne, who fondly recalled memories of watching Pueblo dances with them and their mutual friend, Mildred Beardsley. Other friends are less easily categorized as lesbian couples. For example, Marion Hotop, a doctor, and Peach Mayer, a teacher, were both unmarried women. Sylvia Saunders, also unmarried, lived with another woman and raised horses. Yesterday, Jen and I did a guest lecture for some students in California, and I said, tomorrow I'm talking about lesbian horses. So I want to clarify, there is no proof that the horses were lesbian. But I think Sylvia might have been. Their correspondence with Gilpin makes no explicit mention of their sexuality or romantic preferences, and why would it? They knew each other. Their portraits taken by Gilpin are similarly silent on this question. You can't look at these photos and say, aha, a photo of a lesbian, or not. Sitting at the Eamon Carter back in 2017, considering these missives and wondering about the identities of their authors, I was once again confronted by that primary challenge of queer history. Although I could argue for the social queerness of women who choose not to marry, how could I ever know if these women were lesbians? Given the censorship of homosexual identity and experience by historians, and the self-censorship that was often practiced by lesbian women themselves in relation to the archive, including Gilpin's closest friend, and I suspect lover at one point, sculptor Brenda Putnam, who destroyed all of her letters from Gilpin before she donated her archive to Syracuse University. Is it even possible to distinguish a specifically lesbian network from Gilpin's broader social circle? I think it is. And moreover, this network is manifest in Gilpin's photographic archive as well as in her letters. The portraits in particular remind us that Gilpin relied on her networks, queer and otherwise, to generate paid work. Her portraits of queer women, produced over decades and encountered individually in family homes, institutional brochures, or sent to friends, belong to a long-standing tradition of studio portraiture. But seen in aggregate in Gilpin's archive, they become something else. They constitute a gathering, a material collective. Perhaps we're tempted to review these portraits from an anthropological perspective. Can we discern a typology of the 20th century lesbian in their profiles or dress? There is slippage here between our approach to a lesbian photographic archive and a Navajo one. A similar tension between our desire to see the individuals, as Gilpin demanded of her readers, and our dangerous impulse to draw sweeping conclusions about a group. Gilpin and her lesbian colleagues on the Navajo Nation recognized the affinities in these temptations, even as they sometimes fell prey to them. But by the 1950s, Gilpin was becoming adept at mobilizing one network on behalf of the other. When Foster died, for example, the photographer engaged her largely lesbian network on behalf of the Navajo Nation, establishing a book fund at Navajo Community College in Foster's name. Her longtime friend and colleague, Ned Hatathli, was president of the college at the time, which surely influenced her choice. This concrete gesture of allyship underscored the extent to which Gilpin and Foster identified with the cause of Navajo sovereignty, as well as their close social ties with specific Diné friends. It also demonstrated Gilpin's understanding of the economic power of her queer network. In my own book, I extend the story of intersectional allyship, including and in some cases actively collaborating with contemporary artists and writers to understand the impact of post-Stonewall LGBTQ2S politics on queer Diné people today. At one point, one of those colleagues sent some notes about my characterization of Gilpin as an ally to Diné people and culture. In your third paragraph, they wrote, you discuss, quote, respectful collaboration as something that is present within my words and Gilpin's The Enduring Navajo. It so happens that I own a copy of The Enduring Navajo, and the term respectful doesn't apply to all of Gilpin's work. Diné have strict rules and regulations governing ceremony. One key rule is that ceremonies are not to be photographed. Gilpin doesn't adhere to this rule and includes depictions of ceremonial deities and sand paintings in her work. So ideas of K, which is kinship in Diné Bizad, and community, and what you call respectful collaboration doesn't really seem applicable here. My colleague was calling attention to the ethical limits of archives, asking us to consider how we approach archival ethics in historical context and in relation to the inevitably polythetic social landscape. It is true that many contemporary Diné object to ceremonies being photographed, although unlike many of the surrounding pueblos, the Navajo Nation does not have an outright ban on sketching or photography, leaving the decision instead up to the individuals involved. Because each ceremony is specific to a place, time, and person, And because the success of the ceremony depends upon the ephemerality, the performative element of the sand painting in particular when it involves one, there has long been controversy over making the imagery of these sacred ceremonial drawings permanent through documentation. Many Dene also objected to the spectacularization of their ceremonies, even as others participated in their display, as for example in the 1941 creation of a sand painting at the Museum of Modern Art in New York as part of the exhibition Indian Art of the United States. As Elliot Elisoffan's photograph of that event suggests, indigenous bodies were likewise put on display, an extension into the art world of the ethnographic gaze established by World's Fairs and Wild West shows. Performance as a whole is a cultural practice at the limits of the archive. Even today, documenting performance with historical rigor and robustness poses unique challenges. Gilpin recognized the dangers and discomfort of cultural performance for her Navajo friends. Indeed, she often substituted her own body for theirs in public talks. As she developed the structure of the Enduring Navajo, she rehearsed various narratives in lantern slide presentations that she gave around the country. Standing in front of her audiences, Gilpin implicated her own body as photographer in her narrative. She put herself directly on view alongside her images. And Foster, too, became a part of the show. Newspapers eagerly reported that Miss Foster was in the audience whenever they wrote up Gilpin's appearances. The first-hand, intimate knowledge Foster acquired as a field nurse on the Navajo Nation lent an additional dimension of authenticity to Gilpin's observations about Navajo life, but her presence also called implicit attention to their relationship, reminding audiences that, like the Navajo people for whom they advocated, Gilpin and Foster occupied a precarious position in relation to mainstream society, a fact even if audience members perceived them as two single women rather than as a couple. But what of her photographs? I'm choosing to share this photograph of a sand painting with you today because I believe she made sure that all the people in it understood and embraced the idea that it would be a public image with positive outcomes. But there is, as I mentioned at the outset, an open question across the field of history about archival consent and an important conversation within Indigenous studies about definitions of knowledge and decolonized models of access and availability. The Blackfoot scholar Danielle Heavyhead and her collaborators, for example, have asserted that it is crucial that we only draw on public knowledge when discussing cultural objects, even as they recognize that the information being made public, for example, in museum collections, is actively being revised. Like Gilpin, I've tried to engage colleagues both personally and through their scholarship in finding answers to these questions in a Dene context. Also, like her, I'm sure that my practice is not perfect. Throughout the 20th century, traditional Navajo culture was threatened by government policy, religious missions, and other colonial incursions. Some Dene singers were afraid their cultural knowledge would be lost if it weren't documented in images and text. Others disagreed, worried about the damage that might be done as ceremonies were, in effect, performed incorrectly, even if the intent was benign. In this moment of disagreement and uncertainty, Gilpin worked hard to make sure she was making ethical choices in consultation with Dene experts. In a letter to the traditional singer Billy Norton in 1963 asking for his help, she began with a reference to the longevity of her connection to Dene people and ceremonies, including Norton himself. She wrote, "You will probably not remember me, though I recall watching you make a sand painting on several occasions. For many years, I have been working toward the completion of a pictorial book to be called The Enduring Navajo. I am commencing the book with a condensed version of the creation story. I have illustrated with photographs from the air of the 4 sacred mountains. The book will end with a few ceremonial things I have of a Yebishai, a real sand painting and a medicine hogan, a night picture of the Yebishai." Gilpin's mention of the medicine hogan reminds us of the high regard in which her partner, Betsy Foster, was held by the Dene communities with whom she worked. During her time as a field nurse, Foster fiercely defended traditional Navajo medicine, studying its practice and working alongside and in collaboration with Dene singers. With pride, she recalled entering a patient's hogan once to be greeted with the Dene Bizad word for singer, a word that was translated by those present as both masculine and reserved for those with healing knowledge. Gilpin's letter to Norton continues with an explanation of what she's seeking. The part at the beginning of the book, the story of the creation, will occupy some several pages without illustration. This is bothering me. 2 weeks ago, I was up in Gallup where I had a long visit with my friend Herbert Blatchford. He suggested using a whole sand painting and then 4 parts of it. Later, he suggested, why not get Billy Norton to make you a sand painting? The story I'm using is the one with the raft. Should you be in Gallup, perhaps you could talk to Herbert about this. He can tell you what the book is like. Herbert Blatchford was a community leader, activist for Navajo rights, writer, and educator whom Gilpin had first met while he was a student at the University of New Mexico. One reason he could describe Gilpin's book to Norton is that he had gone through it, editing and amending her commentary on Diné philosophy and ceremonial practice. The photographer adopted his corrections wholesale, and she obviously likewise respected his advice about how to illustrate the creation story. Norton, too, welcomed Blatchford's idea. In his reply, his only qualm was about which sand painting specifically they should select, as he wrote, "There are many sand paintings about the raft." Responding to her concerns about accuracy, he advised her that it would be best to stay with tradition and make the sand painting indoors in a hogan. The last sentence of his letter suggests that he too sees their venture as a respectful collaboration. "I am also in favor of writing down the correct interpretations of the Navajo ways," he assures the photographer, suggesting that while aware of the potential controversy around their decision, he felt that the contribution to cultural preservation would be worth it. Yes, but, we might think, the structural inequality between Indigenous and white people means that the Navajo people Gilpin worked with didn't really have entirely free choice. They may well have felt coerced into cooperating or done so out of financial necessity. And while there's evidently historical truth to that proposition, as innumerable accounts of exploitative and disrespectful actions by anthropologists and tourists alike testify, Gilpin's lifelong friendships on the Navajo Nation attest to her genuine care for the relationships she built and the work she was doing. Moreover, as my colleague, the Diné historian Jennifer Nez-Dinetdale has pointed out, expressing skepticism about Navajo agency or surprise at discovering its exercise reinscribes the paternalistic structure of colonialism by dehumanizing and victimizing Navajo people. Blatchford sat on a U.S. Presidential Advisory Board, was one of the founding members of the National Indian Youth Council, and as director of the Navajo Community Center in Gallup, successfully fought back against an intimidation campaign led by its corrupt city government, as well as unflinchingly correcting Gilpin's language around Diné stories and beliefs in her manuscript. To suggest that he might have felt so coerced by the unequal power dynamics of his relationship with Gilpin that he would propose to her out of the blue a course of action that went against his core beliefs is, well, impossible to believe. Gilpin did choose to censor herself in The Enduring Navajo. Most notably, she refused, despite criticism from white colleagues, to depict the effects and impact of alcoholism on Navajo communities in the book. Instead, she makes brief mention of Blatchford's community work in this regard. Choices like these reflected her political conviction that when white photographers created them, such images were used to justify assimilationist policies and practices that removed people from the Navajo Nation and alienated them from their traditions. At the same time, Gilpin's practice wasn't perfect. It seems possible, for example, that away from the Navajo Nation, she showed images and played recordings of ceremonial songs out of season, which is prohibited. And then there's the question of queerness. The overwhelming whiteness of Gilpin's lesbian network opens up the vexing question at the heart of The Enduring Navajo. Where is Diné queerness in Gilpin's understanding of Navajo society? Gilpin chose to hide her own sexuality in plain sight, introducing Foster at every opportunity, using we rather than I as her first-person pronoun, and dedicating the book to her partner. But she's far more circumspect about the other people she discusses. This is maybe understandable in the context of the 1950s and 60s. Both Navajo and US society were socially conservative to the point of active homophobia, and she may well have considered it counterproductive to her argument for Navajo sovereignty to be explicit about identities that were literally illegal. Today, however, Diné artists and photographers are celebrating the rich history of their identities in every imaginable way. And in Good Pictures Are a Strong Weapon, I engage with Diné artists and writers not only as producers of culture, but as theorists and critics of a decolonizing queer Diné experience. Graphic artist and photojournalist Bea Nyazi grew up on the Navajo Nation in Lupton, Arizona, attended the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and Diné College in Saline, and later pursued a degree in photojournalism in Colorado. Speaking to a group of my students at Oklahoma State University a few years ago, Nyazi described their discovery of ancestral Diné concepts of many genders. If someone had told me about the creation story, how there's multiple genders in our own language, I have no idea what that would have done to me if I would have learned that when I was a kid. That's what I wish for my kids, for kids 1,000 years from now. I just don't want those stories to be lost again. Navajo people are among the most studied in the world. How did such key details of their stories get lost? In this instance, academic practices of translation have committed acts of cultural violence against the Navajo language, Diné Bizaad, reminding us, among other things, that language is also an archive. Journalist Josie Rafaelito wrote recently about how important the specific language of Diné Bizaad is to her understanding of her own gender and sexuality. Since time immemorial, she wrote, the Navajo people have recognized more than 5 genders, including Nadle and Dilba, and being LGBTQIA+ meant you were sacred. Rafaelito uses a gender term that does not appear in 20th century anthropological literature, Dilba. It is, according to the Diné scholar Wesley Thomas, a traditional term in Diné Bizaad for a 4th gender. Although there have been several studies by outsiders of Diné gender, Thomas was the first Navajo to undertake an imperial study of the Nadle. He has done extensive research and identifies a far richer and more nuanced set of gender categories in Diné culture than had previously been documented by anthropologists. He points out that the traditional social gender system, although based initially on biological sex, divides people into categories based on several criteria: sex-linked occupation, behaviors, and roles. Thomas's work is groundbreaking in part because he takes particular issue with the use of Nadle for female-bodied Diné. He writes, Nadle is the gender marker for male-bodied individuals, although it has been misapplied to those who are female-bodied. Another name for female-bodied Nadle was Dilba, parentheses, warrior girl. Although Thomas cites the widely used Young and Morgan dictionary, their translation of Dilba does not include a reference to gender or sexuality beyond the role descriptor warrior woman. This scholarly inattention to indigenous woman-centered queerness goes beyond Navajo culture. As the anthropologist Sabine Lang observed in her canonical monograph, Men as Women, Women as Men, the information on female homosexuality is especially meager. Or, as the Koyankawi Medu poet Janice Gould put it, because of the androcentric bias of many anthropologists, most of the research has been focused on the male. For all its flaws, and they are legion, a 1935 essay by anthropologist Willard W. Hill is therefore notable for its documentation of what he called female transvestites, and for his assertion that they were equal in number to their male counterparts in Navajo society at the time. Yazzie and their wife, public health professional Hannah Blue, have embraced the Diné gender term Dilba, which describes a woman with masculine roles and behaviors, as well as the term Nadleazza, which Yazzie defines as lesbian. For the couple, recognizing traditional Diné gender categories is part of the process of decolonization, an exercise of gender and sexual sovereignty. According to Yazzie's sister, Janine, the artist is not trying to do something radical, it's a way of preserving our culture. And yet there is something radical about the way that Yazzie's experience of queerness, from wanting to imitate their brothers as a child to the sense of isolation that they share with other queer-identified Navajo people who have uneasy relationships with reservation culture and communities, informs their art making and their place within Navajo culture. In 2019, Yazzie embarked on the Dilba Project, in which they create photographic portraits of queer women and non-binary people and families in the Navajo Nation, its diaspora, and its wider Two-Spirit community. For as many of the interviews as possible, Yazzie is accompanied by Blue, who has described the motivation for the project in terms of visibility. Growing up, we didn't have people to look to. There was no one I know growing up who was out and open and in a relationship or families. And it was so hard to think about, how is it going to look when I grow up? So the whole purpose of the project is to start showing how people are exploring that within their lives and how they're living it and how it's real for us. Yazzie's portraits are intimate, and the process is as important as the photographs that might be perceived as its product. Extensive interviews with each subject invite connection with the photographer, who takes candid photographs throughout rather than crafting posed portraits. Yazzie's subjects thereby become collaborators, offering a model of portraiture that blends indigenous and queer ways of knowing and being in the world. Yazzie has traveled across the country building relationships with the women they photograph, and the resulting images are intimate, funny, ordinary, and profound. In this sense, they refuse an anthropological or art historical drive to identify a typology or iconography of the Navajo lesbian. In Yazzie's words, I want to give voice, I want to give face, I want to give stories. Like many of their contemporaries, Yazzie uses the expansive potential of the archive, the proliferation of diverse images and information, to push back against the stereotypical expectations of outsider audiences. In our early conversations, the aggregation of images of lesbian families was central to Yazzie's desire to create this body of work, as was the question of visibility. To make Dene and other Indigenous lesbian or queer women visible was to render the community real, to create a sense of family for the photographer, even as it legitimated the individual families they photographed. Oh, that didn't load. Well, you'll have to trust my description of what you're not seeing. The series includes several portraits of Maida Benally, who was 41 at the time Yazzie photographed her, and her family. The two connected thanks to a notice that Yazzie put out on social media about the project. Talking with Yazzie and Blue, Maida described her reaction when her wife Gwen suggested they participate. I was like, "You want to put our family out there?" In the interview, Blue expresses gratitude for their participation, acknowledging that we're finding that it can be hard for people here, people are scared. Maida, however, is used to standing out. For me in the Shiprock area, I was the first one out, she told Blue and Yazzie. And when marriage first got legalized in Albuquerque, we went down there and did it. We got legally married before it hit statewide in 2013. Their wedding was prompted in part by their adoption of Logan, their son, when he was just 4 days old. In the outdoor portrait that is not visible, the family is together, the three of them, standing beneath a tree whose trunk curves to the right as though it's eager to enfold Maida with the rest of the family, extending the embrace with which Gwen enfolds her son, Logan. So what I'm hoping you can envision is a tree and Maida in front of the tree and Gwen in front of Maida with her arms around Logan, who's in front of her. The tree is encircled in turn by holiday lights that ladder erratically up its trunk. Its canopy spreads to obscure most of the blue sky overhead. Maida holds a football and wears a loose black t-shirt, same t-shirt, shorts that fall below her knees, and a baseball cap. Sunglasses mask her eyes, echoing those worn by her son. Gwen wears a tank top that reveals her extensive tattoos and denim shorts that land at mid-thigh. Logan's orange t-shirt picks up the colors of Gwen's tank, but aligns more closely with the fit of Maida's, and his shorts, like hers, fall below his knee. All three wear sneakers. All three are smiling broadly at the camera. Behind them at the top of the slightly wild lawn is a gray and yellow bungalow with a car parked outside. Yazzie's portraits of Maida and her family represent Indigenous queerness as family-centered, focused on love and acceptance rather than alienation and rejection. They are images that pointedly fly in the face of current Navajo law. There are no protections from anti-LGBTQS, I said some of those, discrimination in the Navajo Nation. And yet, as people have pointed out time and again, there is overwhelming evidence for more expansive understandings of gender and sexuality in ancestral Dene teachings and practice. It is a question that comes back to the issues of archives, knowledge, and ceremony. As Yazzie asked publicly after seeking a traditional healer to conduct their marriage ceremony in 2019, why are Dene LGBTQ+ and Two-Spirit people being denied access to ceremony? At one point, they recalled, I found a medicine woman who supported same-sex marriages, but only if they were performed in a church or other non-Dene venue. She said that according to Navajo tradition, we couldn't be blessed in the same way as a man and a woman, and she declined to perform the ceremony. But Dene ceremonies have always changed over time, and in this instance, Yazzie believes there's even precedent in ancestral ceremony. I've heard a traditional healer say that there was ceremony for weddings between non-binary gendered couples, they told me, but no one remembers it anymore. But those ceremonies came from somewhere, so I'm pretty sure we could get them back. For Yazzie, the value of ceremony is reduced if it isn't responsive to contemporary life. We do have all the resources for traditional healers to realize what's going on in today's society, they note. They would object that the language around gender, like cisgender, is colonial language, but we have it already in the Navajo language, and their job is to be healers. It shouldn't matter based on gender, because that's how the Navajo used to be a long time ago. It wasn't about gender, it was about being human, being five-fingered, realizing that there can be a relationship like that. A lot of the traditional healers are unwilling to create ceremony, and I don't understand why. Why don't we have new ceremonies? Conceived by Yazzie, the Dilba Project has been made possible by grants we applied for together, first from American Studies here at Oklahoma State, and more recently from the University of Southampton's Institute for Arts and Humanities. Although the portraits and interviews are deeply personal and often startlingly intimate, these grants meant that everyone participating has also known that they're contributing to an archive that will be transformed into various public documents, ranging from my book to an exhibition and a series of online photo essays. Why do they all agree that the creation of this archive matters? The art historian Jenny Klein has observed that lesbian history is rarely evident in public archives. Instead, it's pieced together from anecdotes, various personal archives, half-forgotten recollections, and a lot of gossip. When the historian Jan Zita Grover surveyed the Lesbian Her Story archives, a public archive made up of private ones, in 1984, she discovered that the vast majority of lesbian images are of the record-making variety. Such photographs present us with a photographic practice that is specifically lesbian in its content. It records social occasions in the lives of women living as lesbians, demonstrations, vacations, concerts, festivals, parties. It does so in a manner identical to that of other social groups, making such photographs lesbian only in the sense that the people recorded therein are self-identified as lesbian. Grover argues that from a political standpoint, images only function as lesbian when they're declared to be so in public. Private images, in her words, do not circulate through institutions that allow them opportunities to propose themselves as lesbian representations. In 1979, Gilpin transformed her private papers and her photographic archive into public material by donating them to the Amon Carter. Leaving in all the information about her relationships and networks, she transformed them into a public lesbian archive. 40 years later, Yazzie has embarked upon the creation of their own public archive to add Dene lives, experiences, and ceremonies to the historical record, filling a space that Gilpin left uncomfortably bare. Thank you. There are a long list of funders to this project. I've been doing this since 2017, and the list starts to make that obvious. But also, the University of Minnesota Press wants you to know that if you pre-order the book before December 1st, you can get 40% off. For the sake of the students in the room, I will note that one of the grants that I got for this project was from the National Endowment for the Humanities to create an online open access version, which is completely free. Do not buy the book. But if you want a hard copy, there's one picture in the book that's not online because of permissions. So if you want that one picture, 40% off till the 1st of December. Thank you very much. I would love questions if you have them.